name is Marjorie Kaplan. I, along with my colleague Jean Herb, co-direct the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, which is hosted here at Rutgers University. I'd like to welcome you to part one of a two-part virtual workshop on rebuilding New Jersey after COVID-19, advancing a healthy, resilient, sustainable, and fair garden state. We are at a crossroads in our country and in our state. The acute COVID-19 epidemic has brought to bear and magnified the endemic racism and chronic racial disparities in our country and our state. In these sessions, we will explore the following questions. How can we use this moment as an opportunity for New Jerseyans to envision a new future for the Garden State? What investments can we make to rebuild the state's economy while addressing underlying challenges highlighted by the COVID-19 public health crisis? People hit hardest by COVID-19 in New Jersey are the same populations that suffer other health disparities, such as diabetes and heart disease. These are also the same populations hardest hit by pollution and changing climate conditions. Today's virtual convening brings together leaders from across a breadth of sectors to discuss opportunities for restarting New Jersey's economy post-COVID-19 in ways that intersect health equity and social well-being with addressing climate change, building inclusive and vibrant communities, and expanding opportunities for civic engagement. Our hope is that these discussions will inform COVID-19 restart and recovery efforts by focusing on ways to intersect COVID-19 recovery efforts with other public policy goals, including promoting health equity and social well-being, and ensuring adequate resources to support New Jersey's public health infrastructure, building a state budget that provides support to households and businesses hit hardest by COVID-19, and that support a sustainable future for New Jersey, ensuring that rebuilding and COVID-19 recovery investments address changing climate conditions, supporting investments in community assets that enhance cultural, historic, and natural resources, and honoring democratic principles. I'd like to acknowledge and introduce today's three hosts. The New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, which was established by law, adopted in New Jersey this past January. Its mission is to use impartial and actionable science to advance state and local efforts in the public, private, and non-governmental sectors to adapt to and mitigate a changing climate here in New Jersey. The center is facilitated by the Rutgers Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy and the Rutgers Climate Institute. Second co-sponsor is the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance, which is a network of organizations that share the goal of advancing science-informed climate change strategies at the state and local levels in New Jersey. And the Eagleton Institute of Politics, which studies how American politics and government work and change, how democracy might improve, and promotes political participation and civic engagement. The Institute explores state and national politics through research, education, and public service, linking the study of politics with its day-to-day practice. It is now my privilege to invite today's moderator, Dr. Kiki Jamieson, President of the Fund for New Jersey, to turn on her camera and microphone and to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie, and welcome everybody. It's a privilege to be with you here today for the very first panel of this important workshop. Panel one is focused on setting the stage, talking about the realities of demographics and economics, of fiscal realities, health inequities, and the political realities during and we anticipate after the COVID crisis. Each panelist will speak today for 10 minutes, followed by questions, and then we'll have questions from the audience that you will ask via chat. All members of the audience are muted, so to communicate with us, please use the chat box and type your questions into the all panelist box. You are welcome to type your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be monitoring those as they come in, and after the presentation, we'll address as many of your questions as time allows. I'll not be reading bios for each of the participants today, but they are available at the CCRC website. Panel one will end at 2:15 this afternoon, and we will then immediately begin panel two. Panel 3 will take place on June 17th from 1 to 3:30 p.m. I'm delighted now to introduce to you the panelists who are joining us for this first session. And they will be introduced in the order that they will present. The first panelist is James Hughes, University Professor of Rutgers. The second, Richard F. Keevy, Executive in Residence for the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. The third is Dr. Denise Rogers, Vice Chancellor of Interprofessional Programs at Rutgers Biomedical and Health Sciences. And fourth is John Weingart, Associate Director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, also at Rutgers. They will speak in that order, and I invite Dean Hughes to turn on his video and microphone at this point.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? My marching orders this afternoon are very simple. Assess where we are today, economically and demographically, and then set some of the baselines for the future. These do not paint a pretty picture, but no sugarcoating is allowed today. So let's get on with it. We are now in what we have labeled the great coronavirus-driven contraction. And it is the final member of what we now call the economic trilogy. And the economic trilogy comprise the three worst economic downturns of the 20th and 21st century. The Great Depression of the 1930s, the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, and now the Great Contraction of 2020. Quick view in the economic rearview mirror. The United States economy added 22.8 million jobs in the record 10-year employment expansion that took place immediately before the Great Contraction unfolded. That is 22.8 million jobs between February 2010 and February 2020. Then, in just 2 months, March and April, 22 million jobs were lost. So the 2-month collapse almost fully erased 10 years of national employment gains. Essentially, we're back to the 2010 level of jobs in the United States. But that stunning reversal is dwarfed by what occurred in the Garden State. Before we fell off the economic cliff, New Jersey had gained 406,000 jobs in that 10-year expansion. Again, February 2010 to February 2020, 406,000 jobs. Then in March and April of 2020, the state lost 833,000 jobs. So in just those 2 months, New Jersey's job loss was more than double its 10-year employment gain. We went from an all-time record peak of 4.2 million jobs plummeting down to 3.4 million. That 3.4 million job level was the lowest employment level in New Jersey since 1985. So the state's economy has been set back to where it was 35 years ago. To this point, the hardest hit sectors of the economy had the lowest pay levels and the highest proportion of minority employment, such as accommodation and food services, that's hotels and restaurants, retail trade, lower level administrative support, and personal services. Now, while all office buildings were shut down, or most were, remote work at home policies kept most upper income, knowledge-based workers on the payroll. So significant disparities in impact. The most vulnerable have been hit the hardest economically, and minorities have been hit the hardest. In addition, there are also generational implications. As it is now well recognized, the great 2007-2009 recession punished millennials, also known as Gen Y, many of whom have yet to make up the economic ground they lost. The potential impact of the Great Contraction on Gen Z, these are post-millennials. This is our most diverse generation. The first wave of them just graduated from college this year. The impact on them could be even more staggering. Longer-term economic picture, we had an unprecedented fast lane free fall. In contrast, we're going to have a very slow lane bounce back. So we've gone from the great economic free fall to the great economic crawl. Now, some examples of the crawl, these are a little bit extreme, but it does indicate the long and difficult road back. During the 10-year 2010-2020 expansion, employment growth in New Jersey averaged 40,000 jobs per year. That's 40,000 jobs per year for 10 straight years. To recapture the 800,000 jobs we just lost, that would take 20 years. 20 years at 40,000 per year would result in a gain of 800,000 jobs. And that assumes that 20-year period would not have a recession. So it could take until 2040 for full recovery. Now, hopefully that's an extreme case. A little bit more optimistically, but still not very pleasant, the best employment growth period in New Jersey took place between 1982 and 1988, a 6-year period between 82 and 88. And we added just under 100,000 jobs per year. That was a unique period in New Jersey's economic history. Now, if we could grow it at 100,000 jobs per year going forward, it would still take 8 years to regain 800,000 jobs, which would mean sometime in 2029 or 2030. So we are really looking toward the next decade before full recovery is achieved. Now, 100 years ago, we were just entering the roaring 20s, the roaring 2020s, or roaring 1920s. Just 5 months ago, there was some speculation that we would again be entering the roaring 20s, this time the roaring 2020s. Well, I think as we all realize, the coronavirus put an end to that fantasy. Instead, we now face a decade that's going to make up a very, very long road back. Now, I could continue with a litany of unprecedented metrics, but I think you get the picture. Let's just say we've had a near-death economic experience, and this is the base from which the future of New Jersey is going to have to be invented. And the post-coronavirus economic world is going to be quite different from the pre-coronavirus world. Now, the Great Contraction has already caused many upheavals across many industries. Within my altered time, let me focus on simply one, the office market ecosystem, which is really central to the post-industrial, knowledge-intensive economy of New Jersey. And this is an ecosystem that has been central over the past decade to our urban economic revival. And the macro question we face is, will the magnitude of distress in office markets caused by the pandemic match the distress of bricks and mortar retailing that was caused by the rise of e-commerce? As I just mentioned, office market trends have been an integral part of the urban economic revitalization of the past decade. Two key dynamics underlaid that. First, the belief that innovation thrives in dense, interactive, creative urban environments and is stifled in insular, one-dimensional suburban campuses. New Jersey spent the last decade trying to stamp out sprawl with a lot of success. Second, open, unencumbered, and interactive workplace design within an office building helped generate creative ideas, promoted collaboration and efficiencies. It built organizational cultures and enhanced communication. Office densification became the norm, more crowding, less square feet per person. Both of these pre-pandemic protocols now represent virtually everything discouraged by social distancing and health protection measures. So how we use physical spaces and where they will be located will be transformed in the foreseeable future. So a watershed moment for the world of work is approaching. The spring of our economic confinement, March of 2020 through June of 2020, spawned remote, out-of-the-office, work-at-home practices and protocols. These were quickly embraced by many organizations and their white-collar employees. Now that the stay-at-home quarantines are starting to be lifted, we have a whole series of back-to-work uncertainties that have emerged, and we are basically in uncharted territory. Central issue: how will the overall office ecosystem be reshaped? How will the system of work permanently change? What will be the new normal or the new abnormal? One thing is certain: office rebalancing will be one of the determinants of ensuring economic opportunity and economic equity for all New Jerseyans. I think the public policy task is to ensure that new office ecologies become the centerpieces of new, healthy, equitable residential communities. Bottom line, this is too good of a crisis to go to waste. Final word, I promised earlier I'd finish on time, no matter how long it took. Well, I'm finished, hopefully on time, certainly on budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Hughes. Now, Professor Keevy, please open your video and microphone. Well, we're waiting for Professor Keevy to start his video and microphone. I just want to remind participants, please, to put your questions in the chat box. We have a couple already, and we're eager to begin sorting through those. Professor Hughes, you can turn off your video now.
Dr. Keevy, can you hear us? Richard?
I think there's a problem with Professor Keevy's technology setup right now. Dr. Rogers, could we move to your presentation, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'm going to be talking about health disparities in the post-COVID world, and of course need to acknowledge that there were and are significant health disparities in the pre-COVID world. In the state of New Jersey, disparities in outcomes for African Americans in particular start from the very first year of life, when an African American child is 2.5 to 3 times more likely to die in the first year of life compared to their white counterpart. Before I go on with additional data, it's also very important for me to note that health outcomes among minority populations in the state of New Jersey vary widely by race, ethnicity, so that African Americans in general have the worst health outcomes in the state. Asians in general have the best health outcomes in the state. And Latinos, in some instances, have health outcomes that are somewhat worse than whites, and in some instances, actually somewhat better than whites. So there's a wide variability in health outcomes in quote unquote minority populations. And so I'm going to be focusing primarily on African American population. So again, I talked about the disparity in infant mortality. I will also remind us that there is significant disparity in maternal mortality, with African American women being anywhere from 3 to 5 times more likely to die in the perinatal period. We also need to recognize that African American children are much more likely to be lead exposed, and also Black and Latino children are much more likely to live in parts of particularly urban environments where there is significant adverse environmental exposures. These same children often have a higher incidence of adverse childhood experiences, particularly as the American Academy of Pediatrics has declared poverty in and of itself to be an adverse childhood experience. And we know that in the state of New Jersey now, approximately 1 in 4 African American and Latino children live in poverty, compared to fewer than 1 in 10 white children living in poverty. I need to stop for a moment and say that as a country, we need to be ashamed that there are any children living in poverty, which is why I find it fascinating that somehow to imply that 1 in 10 white children live in poverty is any more acceptable than the significantly higher rate of Black and brown children living in poverty. As these children grow up, if we look at the 10 leading causes of death in the state of New Jersey, we find that African Americans die at higher rates for all causes except 2. Whites are somewhat more likely to die from chronic lower respiratory disease and from Alzheimer's disease, but for all of the other top 10 causes of death, African Americans are more likely to die than their white counterparts, and in some instances significantly higher. So African Americans are 42% more likely to die from stroke, 75% more likely to die from sepsis. African Americans are twice as likely to die from diabetes and from kidney disease. Quite shockingly, for today, African Americans in the state of New Jersey are 21 times more likely to die from HIV/AIDS when compared to their white counterparts. African Americans are also 12 times more likely to die from homicide in New Jersey than their white counterparts. And of course, we now add COVID-19 to the list. National data recently suggests to us that in the United States as a whole, African Americans may be as much as 3.5 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than their white counterparts, with Latinos being twice as likely to die. Here in New Jersey, while African Americans make up 13% of the population, they make up 17% of cases and 18.5% of deaths. African Americans are the only group in the state of New Jersey where their percentage of deaths exceeds their percentage in the population. And so we know that much of what we see related to disparity in health outcomes has to do with so-called social determinants of health. And we also know that this statement that zip code is more important than genetic code remains phenomenally accurate here in New Jersey and throughout the country. So a Black child who is born today in Trenton will on average live to be 73 years old, and a white child born today in Princeton Junction will on average live to be 87 years old. It's almost like there is a year to mile gap. So there's a 14-year gap in life expectancy that we see between that child in Trenton and Princeton Junction, and these two cities are 12 miles apart. So part of what that reality reflects is economics. And so the median household income for African Americans in New Jersey is $41,800 compared to $84,000 for whites in New Jersey, with Asians having the highest median household income at $106,800. There's a $65,000 gap in median household income that translates into a 15-year gap in terms of life expectancy here in the state of New Jersey. So African Americans are also more likely to be uninsured than their white counterparts. In the state of New Jersey, however, Latinos are most likely to be uninsured. And obviously, having a lack of insurance would present significant challenges in terms of getting appropriate treatment and prevention for illness. What we also know is that there is a relationship between education and health outcomes. So a man who drops out of high school, and this is regardless of race, will on average live 9 years less than a man who gets a bachelor's degree. The data is an 8-year gap for women. Here in the state of New Jersey, 83% of African American young people graduate from high school compared to 95% of white children and 97% of Asian children. What we also know, though, is that there's a significant difference in the quality of schools that these young people go to. And what that then means is reduced economic opportunity for them as well, and significantly lower likelihood of going to college. What is very clear to us, particularly as coming to the forefront of the recent week's activities, is that a significant contributor to the adverse health outcomes that we have in New Jersey and in the country as a whole reflects the consequences of systemic racism that exists in New Jersey and the country as a whole. And there are two ways in which this racism plays out. The first way has to do with just decreased opportunity for advancement. So studies that look at issues related to employment find that African Americans are still discriminated against in employment. African Americans are still discriminated against in housing. And we have volumes of literature that document the degree to which African Americans frequently get lesser quality care when they come into the healthcare system. And that is unrelated to insurance status. That is related to implicit bias, discrimination, and racism. But we also have to acknowledge that there is a significant adverse impact on African American bodies from living in a racist society and enduring the chronic stress that comes with economic hardship, with fear of police, and the realities of the microaggressions and discrimination that African Americans frequently endure regularly in this country. And so on that note, what I will suggest is that the most frightening scenario has come to pass. And so we have this new novel virus that unfortunately is also further contributing to the adverse health outcomes that we see in African Americans in New Jersey, and the adverse economic impact related to COVID-19 will also negatively impact these communities disproportionately. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers, for that sobering, for those sobering remarks. Professor Keevy is with us now by both video and audio. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Hey, Richard, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Just turn your video back on, though.
Okay.
There you go. Thanks.
Richard, you keep muting yourself. I'm going to unmute you, okay?
Got it.
All right, we can hear you now.
All right. Let me give you a discussion about the problems facing the New Jersey budget. Just to start off on an even keel, let me just make sure everybody understands that we're talking about a $40 billion state-funded budget, plus another $15 billion in federal aid that comes in every year. $18 billion is state aid. It goes down to local governments and school districts. Another $11 billion is grants and aids that go out to Medicaid recipients, New Jersey Transit, higher education, and a whole realm of nonprofit groups. The remaining, about $8 billion, is on the state government itself. The majority of the revenue supporting the state budget, 72%, is from the income tax and the sales tax. If something goes wrong with the economy, the income tax and the sales tax is going to disappear. And the nexus of the problem that we face today is the immense economic stress the country is facing, as well as New Jersey. And also, it impacts the state revenue sources and also the new monies that needed to fight the virus. Those people who are in the business of estimating revenue know it could be difficult at any time. And during these times, it is even more difficult. We're looking at a big budget gap. The governor has suggested that we issue $5 billion of bonds, perhaps up as high as $10 billion. In my opinion, that would be a big mistake. Under any scenario, the state must make significant spending reductions. Each budget reduction is going to have its constituents, going to have its objectives. As you remember, almost 80% of our money leaves the state government. So there's going to be a lot of people not too happy with budgetary reductions. If I was looking at the budget, I used to do that for a profession, I would eliminate all new and expanded programs that were scheduled to go into effect in 2021, including increases in school aid. Second, I'd direct the school districts to consider developing options of 5 to 10% additional reductions if we can't even meet that level. I would defer all salary increases for state employees for the next year and a half. I would initiate an aggressive furlough program through at least October of 2020 and allow those folks to get unemployment benefits, which in some cases would give them more money. I would increase medical spending, including Medicaid and the CHIP program. Given the significant layoffs occurring in the general economy, poor people are going to need this medical assistance. I would say, thank God for Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. Finally, I would defer most of the proposed pension contributions. Will this be sufficient? Will this balance our budget? Perhaps, especially if it's augmented by a reasonable amount of additional federal aid. If additional federal aid is not received, almost inconceivably in my view, but who knows, the action then has to be additional taxes and additional revenue. And certainly we should also include in that a review of the over $30 billion of tax expenditures that are in the tax code. Tax credits, tax deductions, preferential tax rates that benefiting certain corporations and certain individuals. Surely, some of these tax breaks were ill-conceived to begin with, outlived their reasonableness and usefulness, and should be eliminated, reduced, or perhaps suspended for a few years until we get beyond this problem. Furthermore, I want to point out that New Jersey residents who are working in New York pay New York tax. We lose, if that's the right verb, $4 billion a year from people who are working in New York who pay New York tax. Lots of those people are now doing work from home. We need to recapture that money. Hard to figure out the exact amount, but it's not a small number. In my opinion, the selling of the bonds for operating purposes must be avoided. Not because the Supreme Court of New Jersey has ruled it unconstitutional, but more important, it's just simply bad public policy and bad financing. By definition, think of it this way. These are one-time revenue sources. What does that do to the following year? This would create a double negative. One-time bond funds, some additional federal dollars. For example, let's take a $40 billion state budget. It includes $5 or $10 billion of bond funds and maybe $3 billion of federal aid. In the next year, those monies will disappear. And we'll have another $350 million of debt service. What do we do then? Issue another bond? Some would argue that the revenue is going to return to normal. This is not likely. In fact, it's impossible. After a much less disastrous recession in 2008, it took New Jersey 6 years to come back up to the level before the recession. In my judgment, it is best to bite the bullet now and to struggle year after year if we do some bad things. Now, the 10,000-pound gorilla is the pension fund. At the end of the virus-induced disaster, pension funds will be in worse condition than it has ever been. However, to borrow is even worse. In my opinion, it's far better to defer whatever needed in pension payments and then slowly build it back up when the revenues come back on track. Just as important, we should consider leveraging or securitizing several state-owned assets and transferring such assets to the pension fund. We did that to a limited extent with the lottery, and it's worked out fine. But we need a bigger situation, a bigger answer to the current problem. So before I end, let me just reiterate in a summary of fashion of what I covered. We got a $40 billion budget. We got additional aid. It's being devastated because our revenues are not coming in. So we need to reduce spending. Now, there's some people out there who say, just cut the budget, that'll solve the problem. Well, that's not doable either. We got too many important things that are in there, but everything is not critical. Second, borrowing $5 to $10 billion will lead to a disaster, in my opinion. Not simply additional debt service we're going to have to pay, it's the one-timeness of the money. Third, additional help from the federal government must be vigorously pursued by New Jersey and by all the states and by the national organizations that exist out there. We should defer as much as possible or as much as needed pension contributions and relook at the entire pension system. Finally, and not many people on the end of this will agree with this, more taxes Never a great option, but in my opinion is inevitable. Best to do it now. Carefully explain to the public why it's realistic and why it's viable and why it's much better than issuing debt. Or perhaps we defer certain tax expenditures in the tax code. But these things are difficult decisions. The problem is immense. The country, New Jersey, has never faced a financial situation quite like it is now. And while I've concentrated on the state finances, we have a similar problem with the local district and school district, local government and school district. So think about that, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your remarks, Professor Keavy. John Weingard, Associate Director of Eagleton, could you turn on your video and audio, please?
I have done so, I hope.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with such an august panel. This is a very rare moment, not Friday afternoon, but the moment, historical moment in many ways. But the one I wanted to start by talking about is that it was unimaginable a few months ago that there would now be a widespread belief that government is the answer to most important questions we're facing. That smart, strong, well-organized government with planning capabilities that extend well beyond the next election cycle is what's needed to have any hope of addressing what we've all been living through in different ways. That is one of the two major new political realities I see. The other is that the extent, depth, and impacts of poverty, inequality, and racial segregation have stimulated a national sense of outrage and call for justice that significantly raised the profile of initiatives intended to address them and the likelihood that trying to address them will be part of the political dialogue in communities, in states, and perhaps in the nation in the coming months and year. And some of these initiatives will have a much better chance of being enacted than was the perceived political reality just even 1 month ago, but 6 months ago, 4 months ago. In other words, I think the COVID pandemic creates not only the necessity to respond to immediate overwhelming needs and crises, but at least in New Jersey, it now creates the opportunity to do so in ways that address some of our longstanding structural problems, some that Rich and Denise and Jim have mentioned. The need to address in New Jersey, at least, having among the most segregated schools, the most precarious fiscal structure, and the largest number of jurisdictions of any state in the nation. While those realities may be new, those two realities, much of the political reality in Trenton will at least look the same as it has looked. We will continue to have many legislators whose top priorities will include focus on how the boundaries of their district might change in the new map to be drawn based on the 2020 census. And almost no matter what that map looks like, we are likely to continue to have a Democratic governor and a legislature with large Democratic majorities in both houses. That's a dynamic that sounds like it might be poised for significant change. It's a dynamic that, as Governor Florio has noted, where progress can be more difficult to achieve than when there is divided government. So it is at best a challenge. At the same time, what has changed, perhaps for a long term, is that Governor Murphy has become much more visible and seemingly sure-footed in this crisis than he was for his first 2 years in office. This could shift the power dynamic in Trenton enough to create more collaborative, productive paths for significant change. As could the fact that everybody in the legislature, everybody in the administration, everybody in New Jersey has been watching the news, has been aware of what's been going on the past months with COVID, the past weeks since George Floyd was killed, and there may be more of an appetite or more potential support for major changes that would not have been considered politically feasible in the recent past. A few final points and suggestions I'll make. One is, I think it's important to explain to students and to other young people that the next months and years can be a great time to go work in government. It will be challenging, difficult, and important, and it's going to require a whole generation of younger people to replace the people who got there in the 70s and retired, and to build on new ideas, put them into governmental thinking. I think it's time to revisit the ideas of reinventing government that were popular in some circles in the late 1990s. There was a commission, there was a book by Al Gore, but I think it's important that as the need for new programs or changed programs are noted and recognized, that there's also effort given to set them up in a way that they can be implemented in a way that is user-friendly, that is efficient, or as efficient as government can be, and it doesn't create an easy target for people who might have been suspicious of the idea to begin with. The major political reality of this moment is not new, and that is that elections matter. Who registers to vote and who turns out this November, whether in person or by mail, will be the largest determinant of what new political realities really are, and what new political realities will be possible after COVID-19. I want to close with a quote from Peter Goldmark, who was executive director of the Port Authority in the late 1970s. He was talking about the potential, about the New Jersey side of the Hudson River waterfront and the possibility of cleaning it up and generating new development, something that everybody seemed to be in favor of but seemed not to be happening. And he said it was an area of insurmountable potential. I hope as we begin to try to repair the world and address the political realities of today as they are and as they change, I hope that surmounting the potential we face in this moment is something we can do and do well. Thank you. Be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you too for helping us to look forward to what can be done. All four presentations contain quite a lot of sobering data and observations, and it's clear that where we are now is terrible. But it's also clear that there is a perhaps unprecedented opportunity to move forward. And I'm interested, I invite all of the panelists for section one to turn on your video now. Feel free to unmute yourself when you're speaking. But I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about what signals you'll be looking for over the coming weeks and months to indicate that New Jersey is actually moving in a better and in a better direction with regard to advancing the public policy goals outlined by Marjorie early on as she introduced this panel, and the public policy goals to which you alluded during your presentation. Professor Hughes, Dean Hughes, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. We're going to be, well, next Thursday is the signature date for New Jersey. We'll get our May employment data. We had the U.S. data last Friday, and it indicated somewhat of a stabilization. Most of us have been dubious about that, but it is what it is. So we'll be monitoring that data to see if New Jersey is starting to bottom out. We'll be looking at the individual sectors that hopefully will change, particularly those sectors that employ a number of below average income individuals and the like, and minority individuals, to see if any progress is made there. Before the Great Contraction started, finally, on a national level and in New Jersey, unemployment rates for African Americans was reaching almost historical low levels. And that's the other tragedy of the coronavirus. That enormous progress was stopped at a dime. The income gains have been lost. So the coronavirus has increased, I think, disparities. As I had mentioned, many of us in white-collar jobs, our salaries were not interrupted. We are now doing our work online for the most part. We're running this conference online. So it's a little bit uncomfortable, but we have not borne any of the economic sacrifices that many other groups have had to bear. So tracing those sectors that have been most impacted is really going to be important for the balance of this year.
Thanks very much. Dr. Rogers?
So in terms of moving in the right direction, I have to admit I am not particularly optimistic because one of the things that we have to recognize is that in New Jersey, as well as the rest of the country, most often health insurance is tied to employment. And as people lose their jobs, they will lose their insurance. And as they lose their insurance, they will lose access to care and obviously access to the ability to pay for their medications and the like. And so it will be important to see whether or not Richard's suggestion of spending more on healthcare comes to pass. I certainly am in agreement that over time we need to disentangle health insurance from employment and get universal access to healthcare. And if COVID has done nothing, I believe it has shown us the dangers of not moving in that direction, although I don't believe that will be a short-term strategy. The other area that I am particularly concerned about is that as the moratorium on evictions is lifted in many of our cities, as people again lose their jobs and aren't able to pay their rent, we're going to see an increase in the number of homeless people, particularly homeless families. So in the short term, I have to confess, I'm not seeing a lot to be optimistic about, and I think one of the challenges for us as a state and a nation will be the degree to which we allow people to suffer to the degrees that are currently predicted, or are we willing to take bold moves in order to prevent that from happening and worsening disparity?
If you had to choose the first bold move, what would that be?
I think the first bold move really would be looking economically at guaranteed minimum income and universal access to healthcare.
Thanks. Professor Keevy? Any reactions to that, especially given the dismal look at state fiscal situations?
Oh,
Richard, I'm going to unmute you. You should be able to talk now.
okay. I'm not very optimistic about the next 6 to 20 months. The economy has taken a devastating hit. Programs that the state is very proud of and has been doing great things for. Aid to school districts, expansion of higher education monies for students, expansion of higher education facilities, transit improvement, capital improvements in the state. All of those are going to be significantly strained because of the revenue impact. The administration, the Murphy administration estimating anywhere between $7 and $10 billion of shortfalls over the next 24 months. I'm less sanguine about that, but it's going to be very difficult. And how the state pulls out of that is going to be, from a budget point of view, I understand all the social impact. That's why in my comments I made sure I would say no matter what cuts go on, we can't reduce the Affordable Care Act and the Medicaid program. In fact, they should be expanded. New Jersey, unlike 13 other states, expanded their Medicaid program through the Affordable Care Act. We have a lot more people receiving health care through the Affordable Care Act than otherwise would have been. A big date is going to be July 15th and July 20th, where we're going to receive the income tax that we usually would have been deposited on April 15th. My guess is that's going to be a telling number. There's no doubt that those folks who are well off, have been working, Wall Street community, et cetera, they're going to continue to pay their payments June, July 15th. But there's been a lot of people impacted that are not going to be able to pay taxes and maybe even strained to pay their property taxes. So we're going to have lots of constraints at the local level, the school district level, and the state level. How we deal with all that is going to be very difficult. In my comments, I unfortunately think we're going to have to raise taxes. Now, people would say, now, how can you raise taxes in an environment where we have it down? Well, there's certain people who could probably afford it, so we have to be carefully how we structure the tax payment. So why don't we go with a bond? You heard my rhetoric on that. That'll bury us for the next 4 or 5 years if we go in that bond method. So I'm worried over the next 2 fiscal years because we have a lot of good things we did, and I'm not so sure whether they're going to be able to continue on that same level.
Thanks. John Weingart, what are the signals you'll be looking for in the coming weeks and months?
I'll be looking in New Jersey to see whether the Restart and Recovery Commission that Governor Murphy put together ends up being a cooperative effort with the legislative leadership and the administration, and what kind of recommendations they come up with. I'm not sure I expect to see this, but I think there's probably things to be learned from other states, and that would be a good task for people that with that commission or in the governor's office. I know the state of Maryland is about the same size as New Jersey geographically and in terms of population, and it has 23 school districts, and its student education levels are at least as good as New Jersey. So that's an idea that is a long-standing problem in New Jersey. I think I don't mean this as a partisan statement necessarily, but I think so much is going to depend on what is in the platforms of the candidates for president and who wins, and probably who wins more important than what's in the platform. But I think, again, the Path to Recovery report that I think Rich and maybe Jim were involved with came out of the Senate, Senator Sweeney's leadership, and there needs to be an effort to develop initiatives. It relies on the expertise that's available in the state and works collaboratively and shares whatever credit there is to be had.
Thank you. Carrie Ferraro has been monitoring what's turned out to be a very active chat box filled with questions. Carrie, can you offer some of the questions that have been raised, please?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kiki. So our first question comes from Randy Solomon. He commented, that Dr. Keevy and Dr. Hughes both looked at previous depressions, recessions to predict the future rates of growth. But he's curious why they chose those events when looking at this COVID event. Previous conditions were due to conditions inherent in the economy, while this one is a crisis whose root is exogenous to the economy. It seems that a better comparison would be bounce backs that occur after a war or natural disaster. So he was wondering if the panelists could discuss the rationale for looking at one frame versus another.
I'll jump in first. Past history, which Jim is going to pick up on, I'm sure. I'm looking at it from just simply the flow of revenue into the state. And it doesn't make, to me, from a budget point of view, from a fiscal point of view, it doesn't make too much difference what the cause was in the past and what the cause is now. I can tell you that the impact of the current virus situation is much more devastating than the financial impact of the past. I don't disagree with the observations made by our questioner, but I don't think it makes any difference what you compare it to. The problem is real. The revenue impact is significant.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on that?
I just to add to maybe to what I said and what others said, I think it's easy to be pessimistic, probably always, but certainly at the moment. I think the glimmer of hope I look at is that there's a pretty widespread recognition that major actions of some kind are needed, major changes, and defining what those major changes are in a way that is understandable and makes sense is a challenge, but it's not. I think there are very few people who think a normal stopgap measure or Band-Aid type approach is going to be what's called for, even going back to just dealing with climate change, much less adding in all that's at the forefront now.
Yeah, that's a good question from Randy. And 4 of the last recessions prior to this one were really caused by economic bubbles that burst. That is, excesses that had built up in the economy, and those were the driving forces of the economic downturn. However, the impact is very, very similar. Another reason is that payroll employment statistics were first compiled in 1939, and that's our oldest data series. So anything really prior to World War II in terms of jobs are really dubious data. And then a number of the other economic metrics were not compiled before the 60s and early 70s. So to some degree, we're prisoners of the data. And recovery from a deliberate shutdown of the economy does promise to be different from recoveries of past recessions. And so that's like one of the reasons we like to say is we're in uncharted territory, but that's usually a shield because our real answer is we don't have a clue to what's going to happen. So it's uncharted, and there is no silver bullet going forward in terms of an exact analogy, but certainly the sheer depth that the economy or the depth of the downturn is such that the one thing that's certain is it's going to take an awful long time to get ourselves out of this hole.
So the one thing I would like to offer, having no expertise in economics whatsoever, to be totally clear, is my biggest concern is the degree to which we are not understanding the continued seriousness of coronavirus, and that there is a perception in the country that we have come out of it. We have not. And if we don't engage in all of those important public health practices for all of the things that we attempt to do to bring back the economy, we could actually move backwards again. And so we can't underestimate the lack of national leadership continuing to put forward the message that we are in no way out of the woods when it comes to COVID-19.
Denise, you're exactly right. And that's the exact reason that the stock market plummeted yesterday. There was increasing news that the virus was increasing in a number of parts of the country. The stock market and those that participate in it had built up market prices the past several weeks on the expectation that the worst was past. And then when the realization was, hey, the worst is not past, to say the least, or the worst is yet to come. Wow, the markets really hit the skids.
Great. Thank you all for your responses. Our next question is from Nat Bonningheimer, who states that the responsibility to address economic and public health inequity often falls to state agencies who have these missions at their heart. However, not all agencies tend to hold these goals as centrally. Dr. Keevy discussed some economic changes, but Nat asked how you feel that these agencies, especially the NJDOT, New Jersey Department of Transportation, should change its investment and system management priorities to make disadvantaged communities healthier, to support growth in more accessible urban places, and to create better and safer connections to employment and other activities that are critically important to day to day.
It's directed at me, but I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Other than I would agree that transit availability for disabled folks and people have finding it difficult to move around, I fully support. And investment should be made in that world. It's going to be difficult, as I suggest, at least in the next 6 to 24 months, to generate the capital to do all those kinds of things. Already, I think I haven't looked at it myself. New Jersey Transit has issued a 10-year plan, a new comprehensive plan, and already folks are suggesting that they're $5 billion short in revenue to meet their expectations. So all of those points are well taken. I don't know a solution to them. That's probably why I'm not a doctor. I'm just a plain grit.
To this better than I can, but the toll increases that were just put on our toll roads do promise a substantial income stream. And I think there's been some discussions on what is planned in terms of what those resources are going to be used for, such as widening, versus some of the issues that were in the question. But there is a source of revenue there that can be used for creative solutions beyond road widening. I have nothing against road widening if it improves the economy. But again, it has to be set in terms of the broader needs of the state.
I wonder, there are ways that the National Environmental Policy Act requires that government actions or certain categories of them be looked at in terms of their impact on the environment and whether those impacts can be reduced. And whether moving forward, there's any way to do something like that around a social justice impact statement, a pandemic response impact statement, a climate change impact statement that would apply to agencies like DOT and others that are undertaking activities where those issues might not be at the forefront of their thinking, but to get it to be more a regular part of the thought and decision-making process.
Thank you. I think we have time for one very quick question. Carrie, do you have one on tap?
Sure. So we had well, this may or may not be a quick question. I don't know. Steve Foster asked how we might think about jobs that must or will and must replace those lost by the most vulnerable, the food service, hospitality, Main Street, small business, things like that. Guessing this is mostly to you, Dr. Hughes.
Yeah, that's always a question, and it has even more importance now. And we have to see how the economy starts restructuring itself, but certainly the post-pandemic health sector, tracing and the like may well provide an opportunity, certainly for job growth. And healthcare, when we look over a 30 or 40 year period, the number of people that had been in manufacturing disappeared and the like. Really, the broader healthcare system picked up a number of jobs. They may not have paid as well, but until the pandemic, were certainly safer than old manufacturing jobs. Infrastructure is another area that's going to be used as a stimulant in terms of returning the economy to a growth trajectory. And so we know there's going to be dollars in infrastructure investment, and that provides an opportunity, I think, for ensuring that we get the appropriate people into those jobs that really need those jobs.
So we're now at the end of session one, and I want to thank all the panelists for taking the time and sharing your perspectives, your observations, and your predictions with us. We appreciate your help in setting the stage for this conversation that will continue in just a couple of minutes in panel two. For the audience, we're now going right into panel two. So I invite the speakers on panel one to turn off their cameras and mute their microphones. Please stay with us if you can. And I'll be introducing the panelists for panel two. As a reminder, panel three will take place next week, June 17th, from 1 to 3:30 in the afternoon. And people can register via the CCRC website, just as you did for this panel. As another reminder, we want to make sure we have time for a lively question session. So please put your questions in the chat box, and they will be gathered up to be asked at the end of the session. At this point, I'm delighted to introduce the panelists for our second panel today. The second panel builds off the first, and the focus will be talking about opportunities for which rebuilding during and after COVID intersect with other goals for a better New Jersey, goals that Marjorie noted at the very beginning of her introduction, goals related to climate, to health, to energy, to social and economic equity. The distinguished panelists today, and I'm introducing them in the order that they will be speaking, even though now they have their videos off. And that is Professor Anna Baptista, who is the Assistant Professor of Professional Practice and Chair of Environmental Policy and the Sustainability Management Program at the Milano School of Policy, Management, and Environment at the New School. Brandon McCoy, who's the President of New Jersey Policy Perspective. Robert Kopp, Professor and Director of the Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Rutgers. George Santos, the Chief of Staff of New Jersey's Economic Development Authority. And Randall Solomon, Executive Director of Sustainable Jersey. At this time, Professor Baptista, will you please turn on your video and unmute yourself?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental justice issues and the relationship to COVID. But I wanted to start with a little bit about the moment we're in. We often think of environmental injustice, if we think about it at all, as a problem of the maldistribution of environmental pollution, which some claim is a result of race-neutral economic conditions or environmental regulations. But in fact, these conditions are made possible by systemic forms of racism, white privilege, and white supremacy that are sedimented in our landscapes and in our society. Just recently, Jackie Patterson of the NAACP, who's the director of the Environmental Justice Program there, wrote an article entitled "Pollution is Racial Violence." And she draws a moral and literal equivalency between the acute violence of police brutality that we're seeing and the chronic and often invisible violence of pollution and how it kills Black communities. So I just wanted to start there because having studied as an urban planner, there's a call for us as urban planners, environmental practitioners, and scholars to think more expansively about the embeddedness and manifestations of racism in our spatial form, in our built environment. In particular, the relationship between what we consider urban or industrial zones and residential suburbs, and how these developments reflect and reproduce racist formations. It is not by chance that Black, of color, Indigenous, and poor people live in close proximity to industrial zones, given the federal government's role in segregating suburbia, redlining communities of color, whites' opposition to integration, and the fact that Black communities have been restricted to areas whites have deemed undesirable. So We cannot understand environmental racism or environmental injustice outside of this racist urban history. And to add insult to injury, low-income Black and Brown communities contribute the least to the pollution burdens they're asked to bear. The global movement for Black Lives Matter and the COVID crisis brings our attention and our focus to the urgency of attending to these racial injustices in our society. And for that reason, I want to make the very bold claim, if I may, that environmental justice and ending environmental racism should be our most urgent priority for climate and environmental policymaking coming out of this crisis. We cannot continue to do business as usual when we talk about climate change, when we talk about environmental protection. So what do we know about environmental justice conditions in the US and right here in New Jersey? Well, similar to the economic and health disparity data that you heard on the previous panel, there are decades of empirical research that point to the existing inequality and distribution of environmental pollution that harm the health and well-being of communities of color, indigenous communities, and low-income communities. And unfortunately, the COVID crisis is creating a multiplier effect when we think about this disproportionate and cumulative burden on EJ communities. Some examples that have been documented here in New Jersey and around the country. There is a disproportionate co-location of communities of color and hazardous waste sites, solid waste incinerators, industrial manufacturing facilities, sewage treatment plants, refineries, and fossil fuel plants. These communities are also more likely to live near busy roadways, seaports, rail yards, airports, and logistics hubs where traffic-related air pollutants like particulate matter and black carbon are concentrated. EJ communities face other intersecting conditions in their built environment like contaminated drinking water, lead paint poisoning, and other poor housing conditions that exacerbate poor health outcomes. They face food and housing and energy insecurity and workplace exposures, as well as psychosocial stress and trauma at much higher rates than whiter, wealthier households. Dr. Rachel Morello-Frosch and her colleagues highlighted some of the important links between health disparities and environmental burdens and social vulnerabilities, noting that residents of communities living near pollution experience increased risk of adverse perinatal outcomes, respiratory heart disease, psychosocial stress, and other health outcomes. Many studies also show how social vulnerability at the individual and community level, such as race and socioeconomic status, can amplify adverse environmental hazards and contribute to the health disparities that Dr. Rogers mentioned. For example, African-American children are estimated to have a death rate 10 times that of white children from asthma. And then we add climate change and climate impacts like heat, flooding, and sea level rise, which would also disproportionately impact EJ communities. We are on the brink of another record-setting summer temperatures, and this impact of the summer heat will exacerbate not only deaths, but air pollution, and climate change promises to increase the severity of these heat waves. In fact, in Newark, it's estimated by 2050, the number of temperature degree days above 90 degrees will more than quadruple, and the number of heat-related deaths in Newark could rise by more than 5-fold. So even before the outbreak, the hottest parts of the country were going to struggle with how to protect their residents from summer weather. But now with COVID, there's an added crisis of the possibility of millions of people self-isolating in homes and apartments that they can't keep cool. Even where they live in apartments with less energy efficient homes, they're less likely to have air conditioners. And even if they do, they may not have the funds to run those air conditioners because of the electricity bills. The current pandemic also serves to exacerbate these existing inequalities. There's a famous study now out of Harvard Public Health that shows even a small increase in the long-term exposure to PM 2.5 increases the death rate from COVID-19. And we already know COVID-19 shows a much higher mortality rate for African-American communities in particular. And there's also some early studies that show the possibility that the coronavirus can be carried on air pollution particles. Now, with all of this evidence of disproportionate impact and cumulative impacts, our current environmental and climate laws and regulations do not provide affirmative protections to mitigate these impacts. There is no enforceable way that EJ communities can seek redress for these impacts. I just want to say that in the effort to look at relief around coronavirus, we need to really think not just about incremental reforms, not just business as usual, because business as usual never worked for communities of color, environmental justice communities in this state. And this is not just in reference to how we're going to spend money with budget cuts coming, but it also is about reforming and fundamentally changing the way we operate and prioritize issues in the state and how we function. We need to double down on a clear focus on environmental justice through every means possible, and that includes through climate mitigation policies, energy policies, COVID relief funds, infrastructure spending, environmental enforcement and protection efforts. And I would like to draw people's attention in particular to supporting Senator Singleton's Environmental Justice and Cumulative Impacts Bill, S-232, and Senator Singleton's Clean Energy Equity Act, 2484, as two examples of bills we need to support in this state to start to center environmental justice and begin to think about mitigation efforts that will have multiple benefits, both for tackling COVID, but also for getting at these deep structural inequalities of environmental pollution. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Brandon McCoy, please turn on your video and audio.
Hello. How's everybody today? So thank you, Kiki. It's wonderful to see you as always. And good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you at this event. I had the good fortune of being with Dr. Mindy Folilove earlier this week in a setting where we were discussing many of the same topics that are the focus of today's convening. And she utilized a really clarifying term that I think helps frame the confluence of the challenges that we are facing from the coronavirus pandemic, the economic crisis, and that is a recession and honestly possibly a depression, and the crisis of white supremacy that is roiling the streets of this country for good reason. She said we are living in an ecology of inequality. And I find that term to be very, very helpful considering the work that I do and the experiences that I've had as a lifelong New Jerseyan. The challenges that we face due to COVID-19 present an incredible opportunity, but opportunity cuts both ways. There's the opportunity to move forward in a manner that reduces inequities, improves health outcomes, and makes our society much more resilient. But there's also the opportunity to regress in these areas and worsen disparities, which would make our society and our economy much more vulnerable than it already is. So while New Jersey is a state of great wealth with incredible access to resources, we have not operated in a manner that ensures the most marginalized members of our communities have the resources necessary for them to thrive, to be healthy and whole, to live a life full of safety, and to live a life full of joy. Oftentimes, people like to say that these communities have been left behind, but I think it can be difficult to accept such passive language when we've had decades and decades of research, thanks to institutions like Rutgers, showing how to reduce disparities and drive down poverty. I think it's much more accurate to say, at least in my mind, that these communities and communities of color in particular have been pushed behind. And this reality has incredible costs for all of us. Oftentimes, when we talk about tax and budget policy in New Jersey, we focus a great deal on the cost of raising taxes and the cost of investing in assets and services and programs, but we don't spend nearly enough time talking about the cost of inaction, the cost of doing nothing. And I think that if we spent more time doing that and focusing on that, examining the cost of poverty, the cost of poor education, cost of underemployment and poor health, and other conditions that generally go along with those issues, many of which are, fueled by racism and white supremacy in a significant manner, it would help us have a better view of just how good a deal making such investments really are. Those costs of investment would not seem so great, would not be able to be framed as so great if we had a better sense of the cost of inaction. So as a very direct example, and as a Blaustein alum, I also was an urban planning major student here, like Anna. And I was sitting in the third floor computer lab when then Governor Chris Christie decided to cancel the ARC tunnel, which was to be the tunnel under the Hudson River connecting New Jersey to New York City. And that's obviously a major project that was meant to affirm and boost our state economy. And I remember many of the transportation planning students in the room acting as if the world had ended. And for good reason, because that decision then was based on the idea that New Jersey would have to pay too large a share of the project cost. Well, since then, the costs have only drastically increased to do such a project. And the NJ Transit rail service remains unreliable, far too inaccessible, and it is costing our residents in wasted time and foregone opportunity. And so when we think about what are the opportunities of this moment to reduce disparities and promote equity, whenever someone mentions the cost of action, I urge everyone very seriously to think very deeply and ask, what is the cost of inaction? New Jersey's budget is absolutely in a dire situation due to decades of short-sighted and poor decision-making that far too often prioritize the interests of the already privileged and the very wealthy. We need to learn the lessons of the past and not repeat those mistakes that we have made time and time again, right? So for instance, our tax code is incredibly inequitable and has been for a long time. It requires less of the very wealthy who pay a smaller share of their income to state and local taxes than the middle class. And as a result, we have fewer resources to make critical investments in programs and assets. If we had a more equitable tax code, we would quite frankly have billions of dollars more on hand to handle this moment. When you look at the rainy day fund, New Jersey has avoided making critical investments in that fund for the past decade up until just last year. We exhausted it during the Great Recession and never put anything back into it until last year's budget put $401 million into that fund. That is enough money to, quote unquote, run the state of New Jersey for just a little under 4 days. And experts in tax and budget policy for states will tell you that it's best for states to try to have 2 months of rainy day funds on hand. We need to make that a priority going forward. This is an opportunity to recognize that not having that on hand as COVID hit was a major mistake, and it was an unnecessary and self-inflicted wound. Second, thirdly, I'll say we need to start every policy conversation in New Jersey with an equity lens and be very intentional about it, because if you don't prioritize equity at the beginning of the process, it will not show up in our outcomes. And even though there have been bills passed through the legislature and signed into law in the past, it does not seem as though having a racial equity impact statement for certain bills has actually been prioritized or actionalized in recent years. So there are lots of opportunities to improve outcomes here in the state of New Jersey, and COVID-19 presents a clarifying moment for us to understand where it is that our weaknesses exist, what are the strengths that we can rely on, and how we can leverage our benefits and our assets to move towards a brighter future. But we need to stop being so coy and stop entertaining disingenuous arguments when it comes to fair and equitable policy, and tax policy is a big part of that. If we don't get our budget right in this state, we cannot fund all the things that are going to be the topic of conversation today. And so whether it is investing in green energy economy, because obviously that has, thousands of benefits that if I were to lay them all out, we'd be here for hours. Whether it is investing in making higher education more affordable so that all of our residents have the tools necessary to do incredible work and have meaningful jobs that give them purpose and contribute to our economy. Whether it is investing in transportation so that when we think about NJ Transit and access to public transportation and bus service, that we don't always say, well, North Jersey's pretty well covered, but not South Jersey. And that we are able to move forward in a fashion where we are adding stations, not just thinking about how do we keep service reliable. I could name a number of things, but the fact of the matter is that all of our assets are made incredibly weak by the fact that we don't have an equitable budget. And quite frankly, we don't have an anti-racist budget. And if we move towards an anti-racist budget, and if we take that charge seriously, not only will we identify all the flaws and weaknesses in our state, but we will actually have the opportunity to be more serious about how to fix them. And so the only thing else I say is that while COVID is an incredibly challenging moment, we are a coastal state. We are only months away from hurricane season. And so even though COVID is a challenge, we face challenges all the time. We face pandemics of their own making all the time. And I hope that COVID is one in which we finally say enough is enough. And we are going to take very seriously the charge of investing in ourselves. So thank you all for the time to be here today.
Thanks very much, Brandon. Robert Kopp, welcome.
Thank you. We are facing at least 3 overlapping and intersecting crises operating on different timescales. The 400-year crisis of racist violence in America, the immediate crisis of COVID-19 and the associated economic contraction, and the climate crisis, which has been building for over a century and has the potential to last for millennia. All 3 of these crises require major societal efforts to mitigate, and all 3 are fiercely urgent. Now is when justice impels us to address our country's longstanding inequities. Now is when we must figure out how to relaunch our economy safely after the COVID-induced pause. And now is when, if we wish to have any chance of meeting the climate goals laid out in the Paris Agreement, we must get the world on a path of declining greenhouse gas emissions. To stabilize the climate at any level of warming, we need net zero global carbon dioxide emissions. To have a reasonable chance of achieving the Paris goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius, we need net global greenhouse gas emissions to drop by about 20% in this decade and to fall to 0 over the next 5 decades. And we need an even faster decline in the US because it's easier to lower emissions in a rich developed country than it is in a poor developing one. I don't think we're going to get multiple chances at this. I don't think that there are going to be trillions of dollars in public funds invested to manage the COVID crises, and then trillions of dollars more invested in this decade to address the climate crisis. So given the geophysical necessity of eliminating our carbon dioxide emissions in order to stabilize the climate, we have to make recovery investments count multiple times over and address our multiple crises. Nationally, the best blueprint out there, in my mind, comes from Data for Progress and from Evergreen Action, which is a new group composed of many of the brilliant climate policy wonks who worked on Jay Inslee's campaign. Their plan for a clean jumpstart to rebuild America's economy, which I encourage you to Google if you haven't seen it, lays out 11 policies and $320 billion of investment, federal investment to support state action, and another 21 areas for $1.2 trillion of direct federal investment. I want to highlight a few of these state-level initiatives that they call upon Congress to support as part of this economic stimulus. These include expanding low-income home energy assistance and weatherization to support lower and middle-income households while advancing decarbonization, to let states access the Department of Energy's clean energy loan program financing and expanding the Department of Energy's state energy programs, to expand block grants for state and local building upgrades and hazard mitigations, and to support transit systems. There are also, on this menu, which is largely requires new federal action, 2 items that already take advantage of actions the federal government has already taken. The first involves tapping the Federal Reserve's new municipal liquidity facility to support investment programs like state green banks, noting that borrowing for capital expenditures, and especially capital expenditures that help us avoid the escalating economic damages from our current crises, is sounder fiscal policy than the borrowing for operational expenditures that was raised concerns earlier. Second, leveraging $15 billion provided by the CARES Act for, quote, investments in all key disaster response and hazard mitigation needs under the Stafford Act, unquote, to advance the resilience priorities reflected in state hazard mitigation plans. This could provide funds to put New Jerseyans back to work, reducing exposure to growing hazards such as flooding and winds associated with hurricanes and nor'easters. And these funds could be directed to prioritize the risk to the most vulnerable. I also think that we have to think creatively about how to use the resources we have in New Jersey. especially because we can't necessarily count on the federal government to rescue states from the ongoing fiscal calamity. As was previously noted, a lot depends on the next election. So we should be asking, and we should be asking this under, even if there is a lot of federal stimulus coming, how can we make the money we're spending do double or triple duty? Professor Keevy talked about the potential need for new taxes. I'm going to focus on the investment side, but I want to note that if we had a $50 a ton carbon dioxide tax in New Jersey, this would raise over $4 billion for the state, while also incentivizing reductions in harmful greenhouse gas emissions. This is revenue that could be used to avoid some of the devastating cuts that might otherwise be on the table, and so perhaps offset the worrying pro-cyclical effect of raising taxes. Now, on the investment side, one of the exciting ideas for federal investment in the Clean Jumpstart Plan is to create a national climate corps modeled on the New Deal era civilian conservation corps, which would give young people the opportunity to serve in creating new public health and sustainability solutions in their own communities. I think this is a great idea, but I also think we actually have a public system in this country that we didn't have at the same scale at the time of the New Deal that mobilizes over 15 million young people every year, including 200,000 in New Jersey alone. That's this country's system of public colleges and universities. And partially as a result of COVID and partially as a result of longer-term financial trends, that public system of education is facing its own crisis. So why not put that system to work to more directly solve real problems in real communities? For those of you who are lawyers, and I'm sure we have some on this call, think about how legal clinics work. Students gain essential training by freeing the wrongfully imprisoned, helping qualified immigrants receive asylum, ensuring children get educational services to which they are entitled, and so forth. Why not expand this model to deal with some of the other crises we're dealing with? Indeed, at Rutgers, we've been doing that at a small scale in the climate area for a few years. Our coastal climate risk and resilience graduate students take a studio course in which they work directly with coastal communities to help them advance and develop their resilience plans. This past year, for instance, our students had a project working with Perth Amboy to help them to develop the resilience plan, and they've also worked with cities like Union Beach before. But this program, C2R2 as we call it, is a small program, roughly a dozen students a year. How could we think about scaling something like this up without a huge cost to the state? Here's a modest proposal. Think of the sum that the state and local governments spend each year on intellectual services outsourced to the private sector. I'm not sure, to be honest, exactly how much this is that the state spends on consultants, but I'm pretty sure it's substantial by the scale of what we're talking about. Let's take half of that and say we're going to make that money not only buy us information we need, but also build up public and social sector capacity here in New Jersey. How would we do this? Well, we could give our state's public research institutions the option on first refusal on these sorts of consulting studies. That'll be easiest to manage if you have a clearinghouse that knows where the relevant capacities are across the state's research institutions and has the expertise to translate between researchers and stakeholders. And in the climate arena, such a clearinghouse was created by statute earlier this year. It's one of our host organizations, the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. So let's use it and perhaps other clearinghouses we might create like it, rather than renting expertise from private sector consultants based largely out of state, so that we're using dollars spent on intellectual services to enhance public and social sector capacity here at home. And let's identify some of those projects flowing through the clearinghouses that could be teed up with enough advance notice so that we could build project-based clinical courses at institutions across the state around them. So then we could use that money not just to buy intellectual services, providing the knowledge decision makers need to move forward, but also building up public and social sector capacity to respond to decision maker need and training the rising generation with the knowledge and skills needed to solve the crises we're leaving to them. It'll be great if we have in a few months national leadership that steps up to the crisis we're facing at this moment and mobilizes the people and the financial resources of the United States to address them. There is, unfortunately, a lot we cannot do as a state acting on our own. But there is a lot we can do, especially if we think about how to make this a whole of society effort, including with higher education institutions participating to their full potential as agents of change. So let's get to work. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that call to action. George Santos from EDA is next.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me. excited to be here. I want to talk a little bit about the different programs that EDA has put into place to kind of combat the COVID-19 crisis. First and foremost, COVID-19 is a public health crisis, but secondly, it's wreaked absolute havoc on the economy and on small businesses, especially our communities of color. Many of the panelists before me have spoken in a much better detail and more eloquently on that than I have. And while we look to recover from the crisis, we want to stay true to Governor Murphy's stronger and fairer economic plan and make sure we put our assets equitably in assistance for the state's diverse population. The NJEDA, under our CEO, Tim Sullivan, has been really central to the economic response for COVID-19. And we've been taking, many steps to meet the different needs of small businesses under this, some have called it a medically induced coma for the economy. And as if the public health crisis wasn't enough, George Floyd's tragic murder and the public outcry from that has really put a finer point on the inequities that we've all known exist in our country, and really brought to phrase this properly, really brought to light how important it is to tackle those questions and those issues head on, and really not wait any longer. And that's really something that's infused a lot of our programs, and I'll get to that in a second. So one of the things we instituted was our small business emergency grant program. We initially put up $5 million out of our own money from the EDA, not out of the state appropriation. And when we were crafting this program, the stay-at-home order had not yet gone into effect. So we were looking at limiting it to the businesses that we felt would be most impacted right away. So you can think, your personal services, restaurants, those types of businesses. And we capped it to businesses with fewer than 10 employees at a maximum of $5,000 grant. We thought we'd be able to support between 1,200 and 2,000 businesses, depending on the size of each award. And we ended up getting, I think, 10,000 applications in the first hour and 15 minutes. By the end of the first day, we were well over 20,000. And we kept the applications open for a week and ended somewhere around 35,000. So a tremendous amount of need there. Just recently, the governor has set aside an additional $50 million of CARES Act funding. With that $50 million, we put $5 in the first program to help support some of those businesses in that first round that are still waiting for support. And then we took the additional 45 for a larger phase 2 grant program, which we just launched this past Tuesday. So we learned a little bit from what happened in the first round, and trying to focus on those issues of equity and trying to help low-income communities across the state. We set aside 1/3 of the funds for opportunity zone eligible census tracts. So if you recall, in the 2017 federal tax bill, certain census tracts were set aside for opportunity zone eligibility. These are high unemployment, high poverty, low income census tracts. And the governor got to choose 25% of those tracts, I believe, to be opportunity zones. So we looked at all of the OZ eligible funds to really try to focus dollars in those communities that we believe are hit hardest. And with this first day on Tuesday of about 20,000 or so applications, I think 38% of them came from OZ census tracts, compared to in the first round, we were a little under 30%. One of the other changes we made was we allowed sole proprietorships and home-based businesses to be eligible. That's something we left out of the first round. We thought maybe it might make things a little bit messier and harder to deal with, but we heard from board members of ours who are in these communities and from other folks that a lot of Black and brown businesses in our urban communities start out as home-based businesses or as sole proprietorships, and leaving them out was proving challenging and an inequity. I want to call out specifically Rosemary Hicks. She's one of our board members who has a small business and works with small businesses down in Camden. And she's been a great voice for that. And my former boss, Aisha Glover, the president and CEO of the Newark Alliance, have really been strong advocates in in making sure that we don't miss out on those opportunities. In addition, we also just launched, or rather expanded, a micro business loan program. This is a $10 million program that allows, again, home-based businesses up to $50,000 in lending for inventory, equipment, working capital. I don't believe they need to make any payments for the first 3 years. I think it's about a 3% interest rate for many years after that. And we're setting aside another $3.5 million for that program in our OZ zones. Again, trying to really hit those smallest, most impacted businesses. The other programs in phase one include an entrepreneur support program, which helps put in a loan guarantee for working capital. So entrepreneurs can find investors and will help guarantee some of those funds. And also a CDFI first loss reserve fund. This is us setting aside money to help our community lending partners reach out to their communities to make these loans possible. Just really briefly, because we've talked a little bit about environmental justice and those issues. I know Anawali used to work in the Ironbound. I understand the environmental justice issues in that community in particular, and a lot of the truck traffic. With the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a significant portion of those funds are coming to EDA, and we're setting those aside for electric vehicle uses and kind of clean transportation technology, and we're hoping to put some of that into the electrification of trucks in the area that, again, help deal with those inequities around air pollution. And offshore wind has been a big priority of this administration. Hopefully we'll be making some news on that soon. I think the governor's already announced we want to expand our capacity to 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind by the year 2035. And that's a great opportunity to kind of really grow a whole new industry right here in New Jersey. And we'll be, again, everything we're doing now, we're trying to take that equity lens to make sure it's fair for everyone. So I just want to close with highlighting that, these equity and inequality and all of these issues, they really get to the core of what we talk about, on a daily basis at EDA. And with COVID-19 and with everything happening in the world right now, it's really just kind of put a harsher light on it and really kind of raise the importance to the leadership and staff. We talk about this all the time. And as we move from the restart portion, reopening the economy and more towards a longer term recovery, the EDA, we're going to be looking at trying to help the smallest businesses that we can and helping them grow from, 2 jobs, 5 jobs, 10 jobs to 15, 25, 50, as opposed to just trying to attract, the largest companies to move around. COVID-19 has been an unqualified tragedy, but this recovery is an opportunity to address all the longstanding inequalities that we've seen in New Jersey and help pave the way for a more just and equitable state. And I'll close there.
Thanks very much for your comments. Next, our final panelist is Randall Solomon.
Thanks, Kiki. Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here, and just want to say I agree with just about everything else that my fellow panelists have said in this last panel. I want to start with some broad thoughts and lessons and then get down to more specifics. So for me, one of the things that I hope will come out of this is that we will learn a lesson. Maybe there will be a maturing of society and of government. When we think about sustainability and the sustainability crisis, the root of it is that it asks us to spend resources to make changes today, spend money, spend time, spend effort to prevent some future problem. And we just aren't hardwired to do that as a society and as individuals. We've got scientists, we've got people like Bob Kopp, and we've got many others, and people in the health field that were warning about pandemics, for example, for a long time. And we just did not make the investments that we needed to stave off these catastrophes. So one of the things I think we need to charge ourselves with is making sure that people learn this lesson and that we take the warnings of experts and of science seriously. We have a climate in crisis. We have an agricultural system in crisis. Due to racial injustice, our entire society is in crisis. And we have to start making future investments. Second broad point is that when things break, it's always an opportunity to rebuild it right. It's inevitable that outside events are going to set us back and create the need to rebuild, whether it was the 2008 recession and rebuilding the economy, the efforts around Superstorm Sandy to physically rebuild, or the effort right now that we're just starting to engage in to rethink the economy due to the COVID pandemic. Massive amounts are going to be spent, and these are our opportunities to make changes. It's much harder to make opportunity in times of normalcy. When things are weird and when we're in crisis, that's the time when we can rebuild things right. And I also want to address some of the comments from Dr. Keevy. And a lot of what he was talking about was cuts, which certainly might be the way to close the revenue gap if you're thinking about it from a state budget, but it might not be what's best for the economy or for our current and future selves. The key role of government from economic terms in a Keynesian economic frame is to engage in what's known as counter-cyclical spending. So essentially the economy goes up and down, we know this, and when it goes down, the government spends more to stimulate the economy, and that in turn eventually generates new revenue. So contracting spending actually contracts the economy. So I think now's our opportunity when we recognize that there will be spending, there will be stimulus to really think about how we rebuild for the future we want. Looking back at 2008 with the Great Recession, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act spent a ton of money on a lot of priorities of the Obama administration and a lot of things that had been identified as priorities stretching multiple administrations. And they spent a lot of money, for example, on energy. We at Sustainable Jersey and many others were involved in helping individuals, companies, local governments take advantage of incentives to building efficiency measures that created local jobs, that lowered long-term government spending. So essentially, we took the opportunity to lock in long-term savings and address some of our key priorities by also lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Sandy, I hate to say it, was essentially a lost opportunity for the most part. There were certainly some bright spots, but we have substantially rebuilt the way we were before. But it was a tremendous opportunity where billions and billions were spent, and we fundamentally knew what we had to do differently, but for the most part, we just couldn't get ourselves to do it. So the question now is, what are we going to do with the opportunity presented by COVID? There's a tremendous amount of rebuilding that we have to do, and a tremendous amount of spending that is going to be done that will be able to be directed. So some key priorities, certainly they include equity. I agree with everything that everyone before me said on that. That is a top priority. We have to rebuild the economy. We have to rebuild social structures and how we think about people of color and Black people in particular. Energy and climate is a huge one. Building healthy communities and a culture of health. And I'm not just talking about the healthcare system, which is part of that, but I'm talking about thinking about how we build communities and the determinants of health. Resilience is another huge one. Resilience not just to sea level rise, which is what most of the focus in New Jersey has been on, but resilience to a lot of things that are going to happen from climate change, including heat waves and infectious disease and loss of food, number of other things. So one of the things that all of those things I just mentioned have in common in terms of areas to invest and spend is that they all require local people to be hired and local work to be performed so that money stays in our economy. They solve some future problems, so they set us up for the next disaster, and they all have a high return and a high multiplier in terms of job creation and generating economic activity. And just as one example, I'll note that during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which is really the last big chance to see how these types of investments performed, conservation investments performed really, really well. They generated 15 to 33 jobs per $1 million that were spent, and they had an economic return of $2.4 for every dollar invested. I'll just note for folks that a diverse group of businesses, environmental groups, recreation advocates, community and planning organizations, outlined a lot of these investments and cited their strong record of performance in a letter to the state. And I'll post a link to that letter right now in the chat. And I encourage people to check it out. So another area that I want to talk about is local self-reliance. So one of the things that COVID has shown us in stark relief is that we rely on lots of stuff that comes from outside of New Jersey to live, like food and toilet paper. And I think people were really shocked to discover this fact. After Sandy, we got a brief shock when people realized that there was only roughly 3 days of food on the shelves in stores in New Jersey. And so if the regional and global logistics system that brings us all the things we need to live were to break down, we're in deep trouble. So I think we really need to think about food security in new ways. We need to think about how we support farmers in New Jersey and in our region. We need to think about how we support the ability of people across the state to have backyard gardens and backyard animal husbandry. And there's a lot of state as well as local rules that prevent that from happening. We certainly need a diversified economy. I think, to have more local self-reliance, we need less reliance on globalization, less reliance on one or two sectors of the economy, especially the financial sector. To take a really big step back, most of what we do in New Jersey is we push paper around and trade ethereal economic chits for like food and toilet paper. And at some point, people might not want to, if things get really bad, people might not want to do that. So we need to think about not just resilience for the economy as we know it now, but resilience for all kinds of disturbances that might happen in the future. And then I think another area to really focus on is power, energy, distributed generation, in-state generation, wind and solar. It just so happens that investments in that area perform really well in terms of job creation, local job creation, and solve one of our biggest problems and also increase our resiliency. So there's a strong role for local government in all of these areas. I won't go into detail in all of these, but I'll note that Sustainable Jersey's role is to support local governments in implementing on a lot of these areas. We've got numerous actions in our program that provide guidance to help local governments, municipalities, and schools in particular implement, and they need significant state as well as foundation funding to do this. But a lot of the things that they need to do actually are investments. So, for example, building and doing improvements to municipal facilities to save energy saves money. It saves money in the long term. It has a really attractive return on investment. It's the kind of thing where you can spend the money now, generate the economic activity, but actually bond for it and save money over the long term. The final thing I want to talk about, which is a huge issue, which no one else has mentioned, is kind of, one person did mention it, but is the expanding digital divide. When COVID hit, every school in New Jersey had to implement emergency distance learning and remote operating systems. And every school district is struggling, every student is struggling, every teacher is struggling to deal with it. But it's become starkly apparent that the most vulnerable students, special education, people of color, English language learners, the economically disadvantaged, are suffering wildly, disproportionately in terms of their access to good lessons, their access to stable environments at home, their access to devices, their access to connectivity. And prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, a rapidly changing technological world was forcing already strained public school districts to engage in very challenging efforts to transform their teaching, their curriculum, their operational systems, their public communications. And it was not easy. And access to and mastery of technology and internet connectivity determines a student's future life opportunities. It determines their access to economic opportunity, their ability to navigate our healthcare system, their ability to be informed consumers, their ability to communicate and affect change in their communities, and their ability to engage in the democratic decision-making process at every level. So disproportionate access to technology and its benefits is commonly referred to as the digital divide. And the cost of technology and the cost of adapting curriculum content and pedagogical systems has really heightened existing inequities among schools in New Jersey. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these challenges further, turning what was a chronic condition into a truly acute crisis. So I'm not going to talk too much more about that, but I'll just note that in partnership with the New Jersey Department of Education and the New Jersey School Boards Association, we just launched Sustainable Jersey Digital Schools. And the focus of this program is to solve that long-term crisis, but also to provide a roadmap in the short term for distance learning for schools to help them get ready to open in September. And I think we're in a really crisis state right now where every school in the state of New Jersey is thinking about how they open in New Jersey in the fall, and simultaneously planning for a situation where they open as normal, a situation where they have to do distance learning, a situation where they might do a hybrid with only half the students coming at a time, and recognizing that based on outbreaks and facts on the ground, they might have to seamlessly shift from one mode to another, and they're just not prepared. And so in the short term, we're going to be pushing really hard to provide guidance, support, money to support school districts to address that gap. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your comments, Randy, and thanks to everybody on the panel for offering your perspective. I'm struck that each one of you in your remarks underscored the theme of this panel, which is that all these issues are enmeshed. It is impossible to look at, or should be impossible, to look at climate crises, health, economic, state fiscal, any of the issues without simultaneously considering both the inputs and the impacts of the others. The other theme that came through very strongly was the sense that New Jersey cannot simply rebuild. This is not a matter of shoring up what we have now. Instead, if we want the state to be a better, more equitable place, we need to expect things to be very different. We need to engage in wholesale remodeling rather than reinforcing. Given what we heard in the first panel this morning, the very dire and realistic view of the challenges we face, I'm interested to hear from each panelist, what do you think is the most critical next step for action? And I'd encourage you to be specific, recognizing that there are many things we could do. If you were in charge, what is the first thing you think New Jersey should do concretely to address these intersecting challenges? Anna, would you like to start? And I'd invite all the panelists to turn on your video. You can mute yourself if you're not speaking, but be at the ready. And for each of the attendees, please use the chat box to share your questions. We'll definitely have time to engage, and we'd love to hear what you would like us to discuss. Anna?
Yeah, I can speak directly to some specific things that are most critical. So let me be clear that when I say that climate and environmental justice should be the primary focus, I think an example is the fact that environmental justice organizations in New Jersey and around the country have rejected market mechanisms like RGGI and the Transportation Climate Initiative specifically because of the equity critique, because those policies say we may have emissions reductions in communities of color, we may not. Let's leave it to the market. And EJ communities are tired of having equity be a post note, afterthought on how we prioritize our climate and environmental policies. We want affirmative commitments to reducing the legacy of pollution in environmental justice communities. And that means having bills that say we are required to reduce emissions at power plants. We are going to require improved emission standards for heavy duty diesel trucks. And what we often hear from the environmental sector is, don't worry, we have money and we're going to put investments, and RGGI money will go to EJ communities and TCI money will go to EJ communities. And money is important. Those investments are critical and should be targeted to environmental justice communities. But it's cold comfort to hear about investments for EJ communities when there is little evidence in the past that those investments that have been promised in the past to EJ communities have actually had the intended effect. And we can look at energy efficiency, climate mitigation and adaptation resources that have not made it to the communities that most need it. And one of the primary reasons that happens is because the communities that are most impacted, frontline community organizations, environmental justice, people of color-led organizations, are often not at the table making the decisions about how those investments will get spent and how much of those investments get spent and in what way. So we need to have more inclusive dialogue, and we need to include more of those voices of EJ organizations and people of color-led organizations in these conversations about investments, and we need to make affirmative, explicit anti-racist commitments. And Senator Singleton's environmental justice bill is one of those examples. We need to support that bill because it's going to face a lot of opposition, because it says for the first time anywhere in the country that a community of color can say no to more pollution in their community. And that's, again, dealing with new and renewed permits in EJ communities, but it's a step in the right direction. So I think those are the most important things we need to think about. And one last thing is about net zero. I put a lot of links in the chat box because many organizations, including the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and Ironbound Community Corporation, are part of these national networks of environmental justice leaders who are promoting just and equitable national climate platforms and look critically at net zero policies so that we don't further exacerbate problems like incineration and false solutions in our communities as renewable energy solutions. In the rush to deal with climate change, we can't leave and sacrifice certain communities. So I'd encourage you all to look at those platforms carefully.
Thanks, Anna. Brandon? A concrete.
I got you. Concrete. I think concrete is, from a healthcare perspective, the state right now has a policy for all kids' health coverage that would help us deal with some of the challenges that we know we're going to get from COVID. That we know people are going to have negative outcomes, that we know that we're going to have pandemics again in the future. We know that people are dealing with environmental health challenges right now. And while there are a lot of children in the state of New Jersey that do have health coverage, the ones that remain who are not covered are overwhelmingly Black and brown children. And so there's an all kids healthcare bill. I cannot remember the bill number off the top of my head, but is the initiative is being spearheaded by Senator Vitale. And that is a policy that we think is something that the state should be able to push forward and then hang its hat on. That is a wonderful thing for the state of New Jersey to be able to say every child in the Garden State has healthcare coverage. That's something that you should be able to use and attract more people to come to the state. And so that's a concrete thing that I think we should. I would like to see more people get behind for sure.
Thanks. Bob?
Sure. Well, let me say the way Anna and Brandon's suggestions both I fully support. I think sort of what I'm going to propose is more of a negative. What we shouldn't be doing is just looking at state expenditures and not factoring into account the return on those investments when we look to cut it. We are in a situation where we could be making very short-sighted cuts if we say ignore the long-term costs of enhancing inequality or not stopping climate change. And so we need to be making that an integral part of the budget process. And so, there was some suggestion that John mentioned in the first panel about making things like health impact assessments or climate change impact assessments more central and a more regular part. But all these process things where we're not just pushing to the side as an add-on the effects on health, the effects on climate change, but really making sure when we're prioritizing what we're going to spend our money on that we're getting the best value for our dollars. I just want to very briefly say one thing. And I mentioned a carbon tax not because I think it should be the center of our carbon policy, like climate policy, but because if we are talking about raising taxes, we certainly should be, I would say that should be on the table as tax policy, not as the centerpiece of climate policy.
Thanks. Did anybody want to respond to that? Okay. George, what's your concrete recommendation?
I think for me, I've heard it said that the economy took the elevator down and we're going to take the stairs back up. So this is it's going to be kind of a long slog to get back to where we were and getting to where we want to be. One of the things that concerns me, and I don't really think this will play out, but you hear some folks talking about turning away from density and turning away from cities because people are going to be afraid of being too cooped up and on top of each other. And that sentiment kind of worries me. We should be, doubling down on cities for environmental reasons because, that's where we can achieve the greatest impacts around equity and equality. One of the things we're looking at with the incentives package, which, the previous incentives package expired last summer, but the governor and legislature have been talking about, a new set of programs going forward. We're taking a lot of care in trying to ensure that things like inclusionary zoning are in there, looking at, what environmental standards would look like that are in there. We're looking to do a historic tax credit, which would, disproportionately go towards our older cities that have those assets that just right now are not, it's not financially feasible to rehabilitate those. So, if you're familiar with downtown Newark, there's a lot of buildings where the second, third, fourth, and fifth floors in the downtown sit vacant. And brownfields, there's a brownfields tax credit that we're also looking at, again, to kind of really focus on those underserved communities. So if anything, I think we need to double down on all that and really stand vigilant against what I think are misguided attempts to kind of shift from cities back to suburban type topologies.
Thanks. And Randy?
Hi. So, yeah, big picture. I know you asked for concrete, and I'll get to the concrete pretty quickly. But I think we need to make sure that we're spending large amounts of money on our critical investments right now to shore up the economy, restart the economy, and engage in that counter-cyclical Keynesian spending that we need to do. And I'm not, as representing Sustainable Jersey, I'm not political here, but I would say, and so I'm not going to endorse the Green New Deal, but I would say all the specific things that are called for in the Green New Deal are exactly what we need to do. Onto some specifics, I would say New Jersey really needs to double down on its spending to advance clean energy. There's, every local government building should be generating renewable power. It should have building efficiency upgrades done to it. We need to be thinking about how to make sure that the people that are getting hired to do all this work are people in New Jersey who are the most needy of jobs. And I think that's true when it comes to rebuilding for resilience and building green infrastructure to combat flooding and to prepare for kind of the next Superstorm Sandy. And I'll just leave people with a thought that, try to imagine what would happen if the next Sandy were to hit now. It could. And when we think about the real dangers of an unsustainable trajectory, it's usually not that a zombie apocalypse comes upon us one day. That's not the realistic scenario. It's that these big disturbances, these big disruptions start to hit us. They've always hit us, but they start to hit us more frequently before we really have time to recover. And they could get worse and worse and worse. And so to people who think that, well, we should build slowly, we shouldn't get ourselves into debt. I mean, we have an opportunity to spend now to help prevent some of these future calamities that could happen that will help our economy right now, but also prevent those calamities, which can happen. And so I really need to think about, and we need to realize that if those calamities start to happen and they start to hit us and start to wash over us, we're going to have fewer and fewer resources, fewer and fewer reserves to spend to fix those problems. So the longer we wait, the worse it's going to get.
Well, one could say we're already in that situation.
It's just going to get worse.
Hitting us every few years, in addition to being ever present. While folks are putting other questions in the chat box, I want to invite panelists to respond to each other. Anybody want to ditto or snap what someone said or contradict it? Please go ahead, and then we're also going to gather some questions from the chat box, which we'll have for you in just a minute.
I mean, I'll ditto what Randy was saying around just costs and investments, and that we need to get started now. I think oftentimes there's excuses for like trying to time, tax changes or tax increases to just, capture it at just the right amount of, at the right moment to get the most at the right amount of time. Just do it now, because when, if you do it now, you'll capture everything. And I think we keep on putting off and delaying tax changes, both because of just a history of prioritizing the very, very wealthy, but also because the political capital it will take to do so is quite great, but the benefit from doing so is going to be even greater. And so as we think through all the investments that we could make, I oftentimes hear people say New Jersey has a spending problem, and I kind of look at them with my head cocked a little bit, because I can think through billions of dollars of underinvestment in communities across the state, in Newark and Camden and Trenton and suburban areas. We have a lot more spending to do. That doesn't mean that there's not room for efficiency. That doesn't mean that there's not room for improving how we run programs and run services and things like that. But we very much so need to invest way more than we have in the state. And I think there's a misconception here that New Jersey has uniquely high taxes. Tax rates may be high, but we also have very wealthy people. And so when you look at tax collections as a share of income, we are not unique. We're actually quite average. And so understanding that, taking that into account, if you get a speeding ticket that's $150, that speeding ticket hits differently depending on how much money you make. If you make $50,000, it can be really annoying and terrible. If you're a millionaire, that speeding ticket doesn't mean anything to you. And so we can't just talk about what tax rates are. We have to take into account how very, very incredibly wealthy a lot of people who live in the state are. And then guess what? That justifies the higher tax rate, because we're not Arkansas. We're not Alabama. We have more millionaires and billionaires who live here than other places. And we should recognize that. And we should make sure that everybody's paying their fair share into the critical investments that we've all been talking about all day long.
So many of you talked about the challenges to your concrete ideas and the challenges that impede forward movement. And many of you talked about political will. That's sort of a cheat in a way, right? Because there is no political will separate from all of us and public engagement. But I'm curious, is that the biggest challenge? What are the specific challenges to moving forward? And how do we get around those? Don't all jump in at once.
A better democratic system of elections and governance, campaign finance reform would be helpful. I mean, I think it comes down to a lot of our problems come down to entrenched special interests and large economic interests who are doing well in the current economy, and of course then don't want to change because that takes away their current dominance in the economic system, fighting against anything that changes. One of the stats that at Sustainable Jersey we track and publish in our Sustainable State of the States report is business starts and failures over time. And so, roughly speaking, it's in an economy, you're going to see a similar amount of business starts, new businesses coming in, and failures, businesses that leave the economy. And obviously, you want to see more starts than failures, but they roughly parallel each other. And in bad times, you see more failures, and in good times, you see more starts. So it kind of goes like this. But what you see is that over the long term in New Jersey, it's just going down. The number of starts and failures goes down. And really what that's saying is that there's a lack of dynamism in the economy. It's harder to break in and survive. And so more of our economic activity is being sucked up by larger entrenched economic interests. And they're using their economic might in the political system to keep newer businesses and disruptive businesses out. And one thing that we're going to see in the wake of COVID is a massive restructuring of the economy, with small businesses going under and all that economic market share, money, and power being picked up by very large businesses.
So, Anna, are those the same challenges that you see facing, or you see as obstacles for what you'd like to see accomplished, or are there others?
I mean, it's certainly some of the same forces, right? Special interests and industry opposition to real reform in terms of more aggressive environmental protections for environmental justice communities has always been a major factor in why cities and states allow industries to continue to pollute and concentrate in EJ communities. No one has ever dared to say no to industry. No, you can't come into this community, because the response is, well, we need this economic development. Not considering the costs to public health and the opportunity cost of what other types of economic development we could be attracting and putting in place of the dirty industries we're so used to citing in EJ communities. So I would say, in addition to that, though, and I'm speaking from being in this sector of the environment field for many, many years, I feel like we have lacked, as in the environmental sector, we've been very content with incrementalism, an approach to policymaking and environmental and sustainability issues that settles for expediency and doesn't think through what are the more transformative, more disruptive strategies that we need to tackle to really get more transformative change to happen. And I think nationally, I feel hopeful, because I'm starting to see more and more, not just us speaking to environmental justice and equity issues, but a realization that by centering those issues, we actually have a much more politically popular and viable platform to move ahead. And in the past, I think EJ was very marginalized and equity was not thought of as a winning climate strategy. And I think now there's much more of a recognition. I'm hoping that is not the case. So I feel like sometimes environmental people get in their own way. And the critique of the market systems wasn't across the board, or we shouldn't have any market mechanisms. But it speaks to that incrementalism. 20, 30 years ago, environmentalists were command and control and let's regulate the industries. And today we rely heavily on voluntary measures that are very conservative and leave much of what is really our role in the public sector or in the civil society sector to pick up the slack and really forge and make inroads on equity issues. And so they leave the hard work sort of as an afterthought and think the market's going to provide those equity returns, when in fact the market is the reason why we don't have the equity returns, at least in the environmental sphere. We've never seen that produce. Normal environmental regulations and environmental policies and cap and trade have not produced equity outcomes for EJ communities. So we need to think more, I think, more deeply, more transformatively. We need to think about much more ambitious goals, especially in this moment. I think the tendency might be to retract and say, oh, let's be really careful because there's not going to be any money and everyone is really scared. But there's also an opportunity to do something really bold and different than the way we've worked in the past. And that's my hope, is that the challenges can be met with more imagination and more transformative action.
I wish we had more time. I'm so sorry we have to end, but I encourage everyone, the panelists and the participants alike, to join us next week for the third session of this timely workshop. The third session is talking explicitly about short and medium term responses and what comes next. And I'd love it if we could pick up this very lively conversation then. I do want to thank each of the participants, Anna, Brandon, Robert, George, and Randy, for joining us today. Thank you to everybody who attended. Thank you to the sponsors for this wonderful workshop. And shall I turn it back to Marjorie for some closing notes?
Sure. Can you hear me okay, Kiki?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, on behalf of our hosts, the Climate Change Resource Center, the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance, and the Eagleton Institute, we really thank you all for coming today to join us, those of you who joined us as listeners and those of you who are panelists. I want to just remind everybody that we did record today's event, and we will be recording Wednesday's event, and that we will let everybody know when it's available. And that concludes our event, and we want to thank you all for taking the time to join us, and we hope you are all well.